So as you can see by the title, I'm going to be talking about state parks and state forests and some of the things we're doing to adapt and mitigate climate change. But I'm going to talk about a fair amount more than that. So that's just a portion of it. What I like to do, particularly when I have a really broad audience, is start off with some basics of climate change, almost like a Climate Change 101, just so everybody kind of understands some of the terminology, and also you understand why we're even talking about climate change. So for some of you, this may be kind of basic and kind of something you already know, but it will be a minute or two, and then we'll move on to some interesting things. I have never used one of these smart boards before, so hopefully it works. But this is the coolest thing. You just touch it, and it changes the picture. And I think that's really neat. All right, so let's talk about climate change being in the news. There's a lot of headlines out there with climate change. And I just have a smattering of them here. I kind of picked some that I think would kind of grab your attention. Things like talking about anthrax spewing zombie deer, that catches people's attention. And that's actually a true story. It refers to an incident that happened in Siberia, I think it was 2 years ago, where a caribou who had died more than a century ago and been frozen in the permafrost thawed out, and it had died from anthrax, and it released all the spores. Ended up wiping out thousands of caribou and killing some of the native people that tend to the caribou. So that's one headline. This refers to a military installation in Greenland that the US built back in the 1950s, where they actually went under the ice and they put in a whole infrastructure with a nuclear reactor and all kinds of chemical processing. It was kind of a secret nuclear base. And the US abandoned it because they decided it wasn't going to work. So they left it there because it was frozen. Well, it's thawing out now. And now they're starting to deal with the implications of that waste. And this one really catches people's attention. The price of a beer might double. And that's because, oh, did I change? Oh. Lesson learned, okay. That's because in many parts of the world, the feed that they put together, that they grow for cattle, is going to be shifting to the north. But hops will grow well. So hops might become a more important part of animal feed, less available for beer. It's going to cost more. But really, probably the most important headline, or the one up here and one down here, and I'll try not to touch the screen. It's a report that came out from the UN IPCC about 6 months ago that looked at the implications of climate change. And what it said was we have basically just till about the year 2030 to really make significant changes in decarbonizing our economy, or we're going to reach a point beyond which we can't recover. So things are a lot more serious than we thought they were even a couple years ago. So with that said, I'm now going to kind of get into a little bit of, like I said, the Climate 101. And we'll start off with the greenhouse effect. So think of the Earth as having a blanket. The atmosphere is a blanket that surrounds the planet, and we have incoming solar radiation. Some of it bounces back, and some of it's converted to heat. And the blanket, the atmosphere, holds it in. Now, one really misleading thing about this picture is how big the atmosphere looks. The atmosphere is actually really, really thin. So this is kind of misleading. But think of it this way. There are gases in the atmosphere that at an insulating value. So carbon dioxide is the best known one, but there are others like methane. But CO2 is the best known one. If you add more CO2 to the atmosphere, the blanket becomes thicker, just to kind of give you an analogy. If we didn't have CO2 in the atmosphere and we didn't have that blanket, we wouldn't be able to live on the planet. It would be like Mars. So we do need it, but there's a limit to how much you can put in without having a ramification. So I want to show you this graphic here. We'll start on the left-hand side, and this shows you the concentration of CO2 up on this axis. It's in parts per million, and this shows you the time from now back 800,000 years. We have really accurate measurements of how much CO2 was in the atmosphere going back more than 800,000 years. And you can see it goes up and down. It cycles, and that's because the planet wobbles on its axis and changes as it goes around the sun. So that's a normal cycle, and that's what explains why we have ice ages. But you'll see it generally goes between 175 to maybe 250, maybe a little higher. And we go all along for 800,000 years, and suddenly it jumps straight up. And this graphic right here shows you from 1950 to 2020, and we're now well above 400. So we're almost double what we historically were. So something must have happened. I don't want you to worry about numbers or anything else here. I just want you to take away from this that there's a carbon cycle, just like you've heard of the water cycle. Carbon occurs in 4 reservoirs on our planet: in the atmosphere, in the ocean, in the biosphere. So if you're a Star Trek fan, we refer to ourselves as carbon-based units. That's why, because we are, as are the trees and every other living thing. And the 4th atmosphere is geologic. Now, up until the Industrial Revolution, the geologic reservoir was locked up, with the exception of some places on the planet where you have a little bit of methane escaping or a little bit of CO2 escaping. But for the most part, it was locked up. But we opened it up when we started burning coal, oil, natural gas. So what we've been doing is taking geologic carbon and adding it to the atmosphere and to the ocean. The ocean's actually absorbed more than the atmosphere has. So that explains why suddenly we get this spike in CO2, and along with the spike, we see temperature changes. So this graph takes us from 1880 to about the present, and this shows you average global temperature and the parts per million of CO2. And so you'll see that as CO2 goes up, so does temperature. There's a direct correlation. There's actually a fingerprint, a geologic carbon fingerprint you can look at. It deals with isotopes, but I won't get into all the science behind it. But you can actually measure how much of the carbon in the atmosphere comes from that geologic reservoir, from the burning of fossil fuels. So that's why we're here. That's why we're talking about climate change. That's why decarbonizing our economy is so important. All right, so now let's talk about what are the impacts of climate change. We'll talk about what's happening now and what some of the projections are. So most of what I'm going to show you here is from the 4th National Climate Assessment. It came out about 4 or 5 months ago. And this shows you annual temperature in the U.S. Red means significantly warmer than average. Blue means it's less. So you can see across the country, for the most part, on the annual temperature, we're much warmer than we usually are, including Pennsylvania. And if you break it down into winter and summer, the difference is even more drastic. Winter temperatures are significantly warmer than they were in the past, much more so than summer temperatures. So where are we going to go from here? This graph shows you the middle of the century, which isn't too far off, and the end of the century. And there's 2 climate scenarios here. On the left side is the lower scenario. That's if we get our emissions under control really rapidly, and that's not what we're doing. The right-hand side, the higher scenario, shows you what will happen if we don't do anything. We just keep doing what we're doing now. So a best-case scenario, by the middle of the century, we're going to be 3 to 4 degrees warmer than we are now. We've already gone up 1.8 degrees, and we're seeing significant changes. So even if we got our emissions under control rapidly, the changes would still be significant. We can deal with them, but it'd be significant. If we don't do anything, by the end of the century, we're going to be 8 degrees plus warmer than we are now, which would be really, really significant. Now, this is kind of abstract, isn't it? It's kind of hard to wrap your head around. What exactly does this mean? So there's this really cool website called 1001 Blistering Future Summers. You can go there and plug in the town where you live, and it will tell you, by the end of the century, what it's going to feel like. So I put in Reading. The average temperature in Reading during the summer now is 83 degrees. By the end of the century, that average temperature will be 93 degrees. Now, you might say to yourself, I really like that. I want it to feel like we're in Brownsville, Texas, on the border with Mexico. But think about it. Do they have the same trees and plants there? No. Do they have the same animals and wildlife? No. Do they grow the same food? No. It's really, really different ecosystem, habitat. It's a very different climate regime. So we would see really, really significant changes. I like to use graphics like this because it kind of puts it in perspective. So when you get home, you can put that in your computer, Google that, and you find out what it's going to be like where you live. Now, probably the one thing that people are seeing the most in terms of climate impacts is changes in rainfall. How many people here, by show of hands, just think it seems like the rain is different than it used to be? Yeah, so almost everybody raises their hand because everybody has some story about some flooding issue or some event that they deal with. So let's start with this graph here. This shows you the percent increase in very heavy rain events. Those rain events that generally only occur 1% of the time. And you can see the northeast U.S. is 55% above the average. A 55% increase. If you drill down to Pennsylvania, it's 71%. northeastern Pennsylvania has seen a greater increase in these super heavy rain events than any other place in the country. So it's really significant. So I have just a couple photos to show you. Those rain events are kind of occurring in two ways. One is you get these big, massive storms that kind of cover big chunks of the Northeast. Oftentimes they're named storms, and they rain for a long time. And that's what this photo shows here. This is a culvert. That was a road. That was Loyalsock State Forest, so that is Loyalsock State Forest. In Loyalsock State Forest, we've seen two 1,000-year rain events in a 5-year period. It's really, really dramatic. So that's one kind of rain event. The other kind, which is this photo shows you, this is Interstate 283 between Harrisburg and Lancaster. This is a Friday afternoon. People were going home from work, and suddenly there was this huge downpour, and it just sat there, and it rained and it rained. This is nowhere near a creek. It's not in a floodplain. It's a flat area that you would never believe could flood. And in a matter of 30 minutes, that's what happened. So you get these kind of really isolated but intense rainstorms that occur beyond those big name storms. And now this is a photo from Caledonia State Park, which is in south central Pennsylvania. This is the Appalachian Trail. And this section of the Appalachian Trail has washed out 4 times because of these really heavy rain events. So they're thinking about rerouting part of this now to a higher elevation to kind of get out of that. So we're seeing lots of damage in state parks and state forests, as well as just in general across Pennsylvania. The growing season has also changed. So this shows you the number of days the growing season has lengthened. So in our neck of the woods, it's 10 days. If you go out west, it's 19 days. And you might say, well, that's a good thing. Well, if you talk about your vegetable garden, it is a good thing. So there's pros and cons with a lot of this. But in terms of forest health, it can be a bad thing. So if you take a look at this photo right here, you can see the kind of this gray area in the middle. That's frost damage in one of our state forests. What's happening is, because we get these warm spells really early in the year, the trees bud out early. And all you need is one night with a frost or a freeze, and it kills the buds. Now the trees don't die, but they will leaf out a lot later in the season. They will not produce seeds or nuts or fruit, so that affects wildlife. And you'll see by looking at this, the sunlight now penetrates to the forest floor. It dries out the forest floor. It changes what grows there. So it has a really significant ecosystem impact. We're seeing hundreds of thousands of acres of this kind of damage occurring every year now as a result of climate change. All right, we're also seeing changes in snow cover. So the map on the left shows you blue dots and red dots. A red dot means it's an area that's getting more rain and less snow. And the bigger the dot, the bigger the difference. And you can see there's a lot more red dots than blue dots. The graphic on the right is a projection of how snow cover is going to change. The top is kind of historical, and it shows you snow cover over a month-long period. By the middle of the century, you see we lose a lot, and by the end of the century, there's very little persistent snow cover. We're already seeing these kind of changes, and I'm going to talk about what that means for recreation in Pennsylvania as we go along. So, let me talk a little bit about the Arctic. So what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. It actually explains some of the things we're seeing here. So this is a normal jet stream. It's kind of straight, moves pretty fast, but as the climate changes, it starts to slow down and it starts to wobble. And so you get warm air penetrating to the north, colder air coming to the south, and the storms, which follow the jet stream, slow down. It explains why we get these big rain events that don't seem to move anymore. So that's one impact of what's happening in the Arctic. The other has to do with snow, because whenever I talk about how we're seeing less snow cover, people say, what about these big snowstorms we get? Well, we do. We get some big snowfalls, some cold air, but it doesn't last very long. And that's because of this effect. So this shows you once again the jet stream and a series of circular winds that are called the polar vortex. Now you hear it in the media all the time. More often than not, they're not using it the right way. Every time it's cold, they say, oh, it's the polar vortex, which is not necessarily true. So we have our jet stream is slowing down and wobbling, and so you get these kind of burps of really cold air that come down, cover like the northeast U.S. for a period of a week or two. As a result, we may get a lot of snow, and then it retreats. Oftentimes, if you look globally, when we're having one of these events occur, it'll be 40 degrees warmer in the Arctic than average because the warm air is penetrating to the north. So what's happening in the Arctic is really having an impact on us. This strong polar vortex is driven by the temperature difference between the equator and the Arctic. Because the Arctic is heating vastly more rapidly than anywhere else on the planet, the temperature difference is decreasing, and so that's what's explaining this effect. If anybody has any questions, feel free to stop me. All right, so let's talk about some of the impacts. Invasive species. I assume probably everybody's heard of what an invasive species is. You may deal with them on a day-to-day basis. Almost all invasives do better under a climate change scenario, and I have just two examples here. Kudzu. How many people have heard of kudzu? The vine that ate the South? Well, it's not just in the South anymore. I took these photos in the city of Lebanon, which isn't too terribly far from here. So it's growing well, it's flowering, and it's making seed. So kudzu is beginning to appear in more and more places in Pennsylvania. The other great example is the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is attacking our state tree. That was historically kind of held to the southern part of the state because they don't like really cold winter temperatures. But because we don't have persistent cold as much as we used to, it's moving to the north and to the west. So we're seeing a lot more impacts of the adelgid on hemlock trees. That's the tree that cools, our streams and accounts for like native trout habitat. So they are very resilient. We had a really cold spell, I think 4 years ago, and the adelgid across the state declined by 97%. Within the next year, it was already back up to the previous year's level. With just a 3% survival rate, they bounce right back. So let's talk a little bit about fisheries. These are projections as what's going to happen to cold water fisheries in Pennsylvania. This is from the EPA. So we have a cold water fishery, which is trout and salmon, warm water, which is bass, and then something they call rough fisheries, which are carp and catfish. So what this shows you is worst case scenario, best case scenario. And what this is saying, the red indicates that we will lose all of our cold water fisheries in Pennsylvania by the end of the century. That's if we don't do anything to get our emissions under control. If we get our emissions under control rapidly, by the end of the century, we will be able to salvage some of the cold water fisheries here and here. Much of it in the center part of the state is still going to go away, though. There will still be fish. There'll just be different kinds of fish. So if you're a trout fisherman, this is not necessarily good news for you. Now let's talk about human health impacts, because I think it's important to recognize climate change doesn't just impact the natural world, it affects us as well. So this is a graphic that shows you up to 2014, and this would be a lot more blue if I had a more current graphic, of the incidence of Lyme disease. Lyme disease is directly tied to climate change because ticks survive and are active year-round in much of the state now because it's so warm. They're reproducing more rapidly. Lyme disease is the #1 workman's compensation claim for the department that I work for. Many of us have had it once. I've had it twice. It's really a significant issue. I suspect there's probably some folks in here that have been exposed to it as well. Yep. But it's not just ticks. There are other vector-borne diseases, and I think this one's worth mentioning. This is an Asian tiger mosquito. This is an invasive species. You have it here. It kind of appeared within the past, I would say, 10 years or so. And it's active during the day, not in the evening. It's small, it's striped, it bites really fast and really hard. It's different than our usual mosquitoes. And it carries, potentially, a lot of nasty stuff like Zika, dengue, chikungunya, and West Nile. Now, this past year was the worst West Nile season we have had in Pennsylvania. There were sick birds everywhere, because birds are the main vector for West Nile. In Harrisburg, downtown Harrisburg, there were grackles just walking up and down the sidewalk at lunchtime, oblivious to people. In Hershey, there were parking lots that had crows that would just stand in one place in the parking lot for days on end because they had West Nile virus. It was several fatalities in Pennsylvania, human fatalities due to West Nile. That was very unusual, but it was so predominant this year because of the mosquito season. And so there's this new graphic, or this new term they use, disease danger days. And what it does is it measures how many more days in a year the mosquitoes are active because it's warmer and water is present. So I put this up for Philadelphia. It shows you 1970 to 2017. Mosquitoes are active 14 more days, 2 more weeks out of the year than they were back in 1970. My hometown, Erie, is kind of the worst place in the state for it. It's almost an entire month longer than it used to be. so it's a lot more exposure to mosquitoes. And that's an issue we deal with in state parks, because you have campgrounds with standing water because of all the rain. That's really an issue, particularly when they carry diseases like that. All right, let me talk a little bit how species are going to respond to climate change. Now, some of them are going to adapt. They're just going to, roll with the punches. And 2 examples here. We've done climate vulnerability analyses for about 130, 140 species in Pennsylvania. Shouldn't surprise you, white-tailed deer, are found from the Florida Keys all the way up to close to Alaska. It's a very adaptable animal. They're going to do fine. That's a timber rattlesnake. They're actually going to do better under a climate change scenario. So some are going to adapt. Others, many, are going to move. And birds are a great example. Now, just because you have the ability to move doesn't mean you're going to be successful. You have to have a place to go and a way to get there. But we'll talk about that in a minute. And then we're going to have some things that just potentially are going to disappear altogether. And I included 2 species that you can find in this part of the state. It's the bog turtle and the spadefoot toad. These are little critters that have very specific habitat requirements. The bog turtle is just found in a certain type of wetlands. Oftentimes it's accompanied by cattle or livestock. They're little turtles, only that big, so they don't have the ability to get up and walk 50, 100 miles to the north. And spadefoot toads are really bizarre little animals. They spend most of their time living underground. They wait for heavy rains, they come up above ground, they eat, they reproduce, and they'll go back underground. They can be underground for more than a year at a time. Once again, an animal that doesn't have an ability to move very well. It has very specific habitat requirements.
Would you say the name of the turtle is?
Bog turtle. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So are we seeing it happen yet? Yes, we are. So the Audubon Society did an examination of how much farther north birds species are found than they were going back 60, 70 years ago. And almost all birds have shifted to the north, some of them really drastically. The wild turkeys found 400 miles farther to the north than it used to be. Robins are found 200 miles farther to the north during the winter than they used to be. And then the red-tailed hawk you see in the bottom picture there, if you're a birder, you may have noticed that you see a lot more red tails, and you see them year-round, whereas it didn't used to be that way. Hawk Mountain did a study and found that many of the red tails no longer migrate. They just stay put because they have ample food and the weather isn't too severe. So we're seeing changes in migration patterns as well. And then we see a species that is beginning to shift to the north, and its cousin is coming up behind it. So this is the black-capped chickadee and the Carolina chickadee. It wasn't too long ago, all we had in Pennsylvania was the black-capped chickadee. But because of climate change, it's starting to move to the north, and the Carolina chickadee is moving up from the south. And if you take a look here, you'll see the area we're in now is probably almost exclusively Carolina chickadees now. The yellow line is a hybrid zone. The 2 are hybridizing, and you can track that zone. It's moving about 1 kilometer north per year. And I know it's hard to see with the light, but these are hybrid chickadee chicks that I photographed at Hawk Mountain a few years ago. There was, I think, 12 of them in that nest. There was a lot of them. So that's an example of a species that's on the move. Now, is that a bad thing? Not necessarily, but it's an indicator. You can clearly see that species are starting to move. It's not just animals that move, plants can move too. And so I give you one example here of potentially what's going to happen to the most economically important tree in Pennsylvania, the black cherry. This is the current distribution, and you can see that particularly in the western part of the state, really high concentrations, but overall, Pennsylvania leads the world in black cherry production for furniture and veneer, really economically important species. The top graph shows you best case scenario. You can see how it contracts. Worst case scenario by the end of the century, suitable habitat doesn't remain in Pennsylvania. So that's one implication potentially of climate change. That's an economic impact right there. All right, so let me talk a little bit about the plan that the DCNR has put together for state parks and state forests. I assume you all pretty much know who DCNR is, but just in case you don't, we manage more than 2 million acres of state forests and 121 state parks. We also kind of serve as technical advisor to all the private forest landowners in Pennsylvania. The plan we published in June. We had 70 people from across the department get together and kind of brainstorm what our climate change vulnerabilities were and what we're going to do about them. So I'm going to run through now some of those vulnerabilities. All right, well, let me categorize them. First of all, Adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation is dealing with the impacts of climate change. And we know that those impacts are going to continue to occur even if we eliminated all emissions today. So that's one part of the strategy. The other part is reducing greenhouse gases, either by removing them from the atmosphere or not putting them back into the atmosphere. So this is an example of an adaptation strategy that I wanted to show you. So you saw this picture already. These are not the same place, but I want to show you the kind of the strategy here. This is a washed out road with a traditional culvert, a big pipe. This is the new kind of bottomless culvert that we're starting to go to. You can see it's armored on both sides. It's much more structurally sound. And perhaps most importantly, this pipe, oftentimes as erosion occurs, it'll kind of perch itself above the stream. So the animals in the stream can't move back and forth. Being bottomless, we have a continuous path for the movement of species. So we connect the habitats.
Does that have footings on it?
What do you mean by footing? I'm not an engineer, so I'll try to answer your question.
Well, I mean, is that precast or what is that?
This is precast. Yes.
Do they put footings down first? Or foundation?
They may. I'm not sure. I suspect they probably do. But this is all designed by, we have a bureau called Facility Design and Construction that handle all our infrastructure. And in DCNR, we have a lot of infrastructure. We have 131 dams, 850 bridges, and thousands of miles of roads. And so that they're addressing a lot of this kind of stuff. All right, changes in recreation. We know that we're going to see a lot more summer recreation. This is Presque Isle State Park. And we're losing our winter recreation because we aren't having as much snow. So some of the things we're looking at is we're seeing parks that normally during the wintertime, you might see a handful of people there on a weekend, that we're seeing hundreds of people at now because the weather's nice and people want to get out of the house. Now, most of our parks, a lot of the staff is seasonal. So during the winter, there's nobody there. But now we're seeing that the people are still coming. The resource is still being impacted. There's like no break for the resource. So we're looking at things like looking at carrying capacity. How many people can a park hold? And are there parts of the park that maybe once you reach a certain number of people, you close down that part of the park or you limit more people from going in because you don't want to impact the resource. Looking at reallocating how we spend some of our money because we do have ski resorts in state parks. We build snowmobile trails. Maybe we kind of de-emphasize some of that and favor more some water type recreation. So we're looking at things like that. We know the forest composition is changing. I showed you one example of the cherry tree. But there's actually, if you look at forests in general, we're going to be transitioning away a lot of parts of the state from hardwoods to more of an oak hickory type forest. So we wanted to just look at what kind of trees potentially are going to do better under these climate change scenarios. So I'm going to show you an example of that in a minute. But what we do know is that diversity is key. So the more diverse an ecosystem, the more types of trees you have, the better off you're going to be. And it only makes sense. And we want to favor species that are adapted to future climate conditions. Things that can withstand wider moisture and temperature regimes. So those are some of the things we're starting to look at. Now, I know you can't read this, but I just wanted to give you a sense. What we did was we worked with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And we said, break the state down into its physiographic regions. So this is one physiographic region. This is the Ridge and Valley. We said, look at all the trees that commonly grow there and do an analysis as to whether or not potentially they're going to do better, worse, or stay the same. And that's what this graphic shows you. So it looks at all the different tree species, and I kind of blew it up here a little bit. And I'm mentioning this to you because our plan, which I brought a copy of here, sorry for wandering around for the camera here, I brought one hard copy, but this is available online. So you might find it useful as a resource if you do any kind of restoration work or any kind of land stewardship. So what we did is we asked them to look at these tree species, and I'll use one example here. American beech was a pretty common tree. So this is a low climate change scenario, best case scenario, which isn't happening, worst case scenario. Best case scenario, it's still going to be doing pretty well in Pennsylvania. Worst case scenario, we're going to see probably a 20% reduction, and in some cases more. So that we've done for all tree species across all the physiographic provinces in Pennsylvania. Emergency management is another one of those vulnerabilities that really rose to the top. Emergency management refers to wildfires. It refers to storm events, flooding, tree blowdowns, things like that. And we deal with that a lot. Now, we also send people out west and to the south to deal with those emergencies to help the federal government. So last year, DCNR employees spent 75,000 hours out of state working on wildfires and hurricanes down south. This map shows you the potential increase in wildfire in Pennsylvania, anywhere from a 60 to 80% increase. Our fire season has already changed. We used to have a pretty well-defined fire season. Now it pretty much goes year-round, and so you've got to be prepared for that. So a number of the things that we're looking at doing is increasing our number of trained firefighters, and reducing fuel loads is really important. And this is a photo of a controlled burn. Controlled burns we're doing a lot more of, so we reduce the fuel load. That's really important so that these fires, when they do occur, and they're natural, but they aren't as severe. Now, if you think about all those fires you see out in California, you hear that term wildland-urban interface. It refers to where people build their houses where fires occur. And that's where all the news comes from, homes being destroyed, people being killed. If you look at the percentage of homes in the wildland-urban interface in all 50 states, Pennsylvania has a greater percentage than any other state in the country, particularly when you get up into the Poconos. People are living in places where wildfires occur naturally. So controlling that is going to be really key. All right, I talked about the movement of species. A key thing for us is looking at how do we make sure that species have a way to get to the north or to higher elevations. Now, if you look in the past, when we had an ice age and the glaciers came down and then they retreated, species, ebbed and flowed across the landscape, but we weren't here. So they had a clear path. They didn't have cities. They didn't have power line right-of-ways and gas line right-of-ways. We have a very, very fragmented habitat and landscape now. So we're focusing on identifying places where we can connect those kind of habitats. So the graphic you see up on the upper right there is Lancaster County. And that's their greenways plan. That shows you areas that are going to be really important for the movement of species, and it is almost, in Lancaster County especially, almost exclusively riparian areas, stream-side corridors. That's going to be really important for the movement of species. Across the state, there's two kind of general types of habitat that are important, riparian corridors and ridge tops. And so we're trying to identify particularly important areas where we should go in and kind of protect those. We also give a lot of grants out to communities for the purchase of property, the building of parks, things like that. We're beginning to integrate climate change considerations and habitat connectivity into our grant-making process. So if you have a project, you apply for a grant. If you can show that it's going to be an important part of connecting habitats, that may increase your chances of being able to get a grant. Aquatic habitat, I know this group is kind of interested in aquatic issues, and here are some of the things that we kind of identified as being important. Restoring the hydrologic connectivity between riparian areas and the surrounding landscape. I already talked about culverts. Planting things that are better adapted to future conditions, which gets to the trees especially, and doing more monitoring of lakes and streams in terms of temperature and hydrologic regimes and things like that. I'm going to get back to aquatic habitats in a minute, but I want to touch on a couple other quick things, particularly since you might see them. We've been talking about adaptation up to this point, but there's still mitigation, which is reducing emissions or removing emissions. And so solar is becoming a big part of what we're doing in our state parks. Anybody here been to a state park that has had a solar facility? Nobody yet? Well, you will, because we have 13 in right now, 15 more going in this year, 19 more going in next year. And so the goal is that we will have 50% of our electricity from renewable resources within the next 3 years. So we're putting in a lot more solar installations. We're also looking at our fleet. And so we've already begun to replace most of our passenger vehicles with hybrids or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. We even have 2 e-cycles, which are electric motorcycles that are being used up at Presque Isle. So we're increasing that significantly. One challenge is that most of our vehicles are not cars, they're pickup trucks. And there really aren't any good hybrid or electric pickup trucks. That technology isn't there yet, but hopefully that will be coming. The other thing you're going to see is more electric vehicle charging stations in state parks. So we have, we put in 9 last year. 15 will go in this year, and by 2020, we'll have 43 of these in state parks and state forests. So you can drive your electric car there, your Tesla if you have one, plug it in and charge it up while you're out hiking. And it's amazing how inexpensive it is to charge your electric car. It's only like 18 cents for most charges. So it's not a big expense, and you don't have to pay for this, because we've had people say, well, where do I put my money? And we say, you don't, you just plug it in. So I think that's a pretty significant thing too. So I think I'm getting close to running out of time, so I want to talk about the importance of trees. If there's any takeaway from this, it should be that trees are great for addressing climate change. So a tree, you know, if you hold a piece of wood in your hand, you can say to somebody, this was once atmospheric carbon. This came from CO2. You're taking out of the atmosphere, like this tree, you're sucking in all the emissions, and it's putting it into wood and leaves and roots and soil. Now, most people would think that if you look at the picture, most of that carbon would be up here, but 60 to 70% of it is actually down here. So most of the carbon ends up in the soil. So soil conservation is really important. So a tree is half by weight carbon. And if you take a look at some of the statistics here, our trees across the country take in more than 40% of all power plant emissions and convert that to wood. So trees do really good work at removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So one of the things we're looking at is, in terms of our management, is no net loss of forests and actually trying to increase forest acreage, so you remove more carbon from the atmosphere. And then looking at ways that you can manage the forest differently to increase the sequestration. Things like changing rotation time in terms of logging and things like that. So those are some things we're beginning to investigate. So I'm going to wrap up by talking a little bit about riparian buffers and climate change. So this is a really cool tool that you can use. It's called iTree Design. Has anybody used this? Oh, this is the first time somebody's ever raised their hand when I asked that question.
I use the iTree program.
Okay. Okay. This is really cool. So what I did to show you here is it's an online thing and it's very interactive. So I went in. This is Swatara Creek. This is in Hershey area where I live. And this is a strip of land that's owned by the Hershey Trust, but that the Manada Conservancy is looking into potentially doing a riparian planting. So I went in and I planted these trees. And so I did a mix of red maple and sycamore, I believe it was. Planted those trees, and then what you can do is see what benefits you will derive from those trees. So we'll start here. And it shows me that over the next 25 years, they're going to sequester more than 40,000 pounds of CO2. Now you can use this tool also, like if you're doing plantings in cities or urban areas, to kind of get an estimate of the impact of trees. So it shows you overall benefits, stormwater, energy, air quality. I just have highlighted here CO2, carbon dioxide. This could potentially be important if we eventually get to a place where when you plant a tree, you can actually get a credit, monetary credit for the amount of CO2 that it removes from the air. If you're working with a landowner to plant a riparian area, this is another way of maybe convincing them some of the benefits. And I'll just finish up by showing you also, if you go to stormwater, those trees are going to intercept more than 430,000 gallons of stormwater over that 25-year period. So planting trees is both a mitigation strategy and an adaptation strategy, especially when you do it along a stream. So with that, I will stop there and see if anybody has any questions. Yes, sir.
Just take the last one. Credits for carbon.
Yes.
Is there something afoot that maybe municipalities could eventually plan for?
Well, that's the hope. They're doing this in Europe already.
Who's there? Oh, okay. That's right.
Yeah.
There.
Yeah. And, there's been talk about it for a long time. I believe there are some kind of pilot projects and some smaller projects out west where this is happening. I don't think it's here in the east yet, but certainly it's probably coming. And like I said, in Europe, they're doing things like this. Yes?
I have two questions about tree species.
Mm-hmm.
You're choosing them for planting. And the first is, should we be sourcing the buys that we make from areas that are further south? Because they're trees that are presumably grown in hotter conditions. And the second is, think about your point about the diversity of species, but should we be planting species like beech and sugar maple that we're not going to see anymore to try and maintain that diversity, or should we just be thinking about the trees that are going to be happier here 50 years from now?
Both great questions. In answer to your first question, and I didn't really touch on it, but the last bullet under forests in terms of our adaptation strategies, traditionally we always say only plant Pennsylvania native species. And that's not a bad thing to say, but we need to look more broadly. So we're looking at seed zones. Seed zones extend beyond the state. So it does take into account species farther to the south. There's a number of places in the country where they're actually doing studies of how species are going to do farther north. And actually, I handle the research permits for the Bureau of Forestry. We've had people from Ontario and from Nova Scotia come down, collect trees and nuts here, and they're growing them back there to see how they're going to do. So that's going on. We recognize that we will have new species moving in, and we have to look at some of those southern kind of genotypes to bring farther north. So yes, to your first question. Your second question was, do we plant sugar maple and what was the other one you mentioned?
Beech. No, just
Beech.
some examples of trees that are not going to be happy here.
That's right, yeah, especially sugar maple. Should we be planting those for diversity? I would say no. Diversity is important, but diversity of species are potentially going to do better in the future. Yeah, so that's a very good question. Yes?
I was involved in a project in my township on controlling and treating for emerald ash borer.
Mm-hmm.
There are a whole host of new invasive insects that are destroying our forests.
Yeah.
Probably a lot of it due to increased temperatures, climate change, and these insects can survive winters longer. And,
Right.
ash borer seems to have gone by the wayside, and now it's spotted lanternfly. What do you see on the future track? Or we just wait and ride it out and see if the natural predator gets here too?
Well, I don't know if we have natural predators. We're talking about looking at potential predators for some of these, not necessarily that are native to here. So it's a really tough one to deal with. The spotted lanternfly is really scary because it eats pretty much any tree there is, and it's spreading rapidly. We have them in downtown Harrisburg now, along the railroad tracks. We think they're probably kind of coming in on the trains that go through town. In terms of new ones on the horizon, I'm not sure exactly what's yet to come, but it's definitely an issue that we're going to have to deal with. So I don't have a good answer for you, unfortunately.
There are a ton of emerging beetles. Beetles are going to have a huge impact on Pennsylvania forests.
That's right.
Don Egan's talks are scary.
Yeah, and you
Oh
know
yeah,
what?
Don is.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
He lives in my township.
Yeah. Introduce yourself real quick, just so folks know you.
Ann Falls, I'm recently retired from Pennsylvania Sea Grant, and I am an entomologist.
Yeah.
Oh,
And so if you look out west, you know, the pine beetle has devastated the forests out there. We have pine beetles here that are becoming more active than they were before. Native pine beetles, but you know, those are the kind of things we're potentially looking at too.
Pine bark blister beetles.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
They're pretty devastating.
Yeah. Do we have time for more questions? Or? Oh, we do. Okay, good. Any more questions? Yes.
Well, this goes back to the mosquito as the vector. I was wondering if, in addition to the West Nile, I mean, can it give Zika to people now?
You know, that hasn't happened yet. There have been cases of Zika in the U.S., but people contracted them outside of the country. But that's always the fear. So if somebody comes in and they have Zika and they're bitten by one of those mosquitoes that can carry it, it hasn't happened yet, but that certainly is a fear. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Talk a little bit more about maybe what's being done in the watershed world and the water world, and maybe people in the room. I'm really surprised. I've only been on this job 5 months, but I'm surprised at how little this topic comes up. We talk about everything but climate change in the meetings I go to, and I go to a lot of meetings.
Well, I'm not sure. We talk about it a lot in our department, particularly lately. And you know, water in general comes up a lot. We either have too much of it or not enough of it. And the importance of forests and making sure that you have clean water is a big issue. When you say you go to meetings, talk about what kind of meetings, what kind of organizations?
Well, improving the watershed, improving water quality. I'm interested in hearing what planning is being done. What's the forecasting saying and what planning is being done that's appropriate. I mean, you talked a little bit about flood control, what trees to plant. I'm not hearing that conversation. I'd like to hear more of it myself.
Yep. And,
Could I just mention
Please.
the Chester project?
yes.
So one of the biggest impacts of climate will be in underserved communities on the coast, and particularly tidal communities.
Right?
And so Pennsylvania Sea Grant worked for several years to help the city of Chester develop a climate plan.
Yep.
And the real focus in that plan has been to address flooding. And so flooding is a somewhat, it's less politically charged than talking directly about climate, because everyone can recognize that flooding is happening. Everybody has a personal experience that they can relate to. So it was flooding and heat that we were mainly helping to adapt. And from there, we developed 7 recommendations. And one of them was to develop a green stormwater infrastructure plan. And so we did get funding to continue, because we felt that was a somewhat low-hanging fruit to integrate climate analysis into the stormwater planning process. And now there's a stormwater authority that's just getting started.
Yeah, I know when I was on a committee with the Partnership for Delaware Estuary,
Yes.
because of the NOAA funding, we were required to consider climate impact on everything we did, which was good, to say if we're going to install a BMP or something in a coastal community that was then going to have rising sea level, you had to take that into account. And I just think that things like that,
Yes.
just kind of bring you back to, well, is this really resilient? Is this really the right thing?
Yeah. I guess the only other thing I would add to the discussion is that riparian buffers are a big focus for our department. Us and DEP are working together on a big riparian buffer program. Much of it is because of our responsibility for meeting the Chesapeake Bay's requirements. But we are definitely addressing that. That's a really big initiative. I see a bunch of, we'll start there.
I have a question about just preserving what we have at times, and one of the things that I see that the people aren't doing out there is even just taking vines off trees. So I can drive around and there's a ton of vines off trees. We work and we volunteer with the state park, and we do a lot of vine cutting, and doesn't seem like there's the money into preserving what we have. Okay, I've seen over the past couple of years a lot of trees just come down because of vines, and that was preventable. Okay, you're not talking about bugs and
Yeah.
stuff. It's preventable. I would like to see more interest in that in the townships, in the county. I've complained about this to the county, even to the point where we educate people who own different lands that's important, because like you said, it's educating. Because that would at least could save a substantial amount of trees, so that, because planting something is wonderful, but the effort involved in planting is so much more than just saving what you have.
Yeah, it's a good point. And when you talk about vines, and one thing I didn't really touch on was that one of the impacts of climate change is we're seeing a lot more wind events. And the winds often follow heavy rain events. So you've got a tree that's in a very soft soil, the wind comes through, and those vines really add to the tree fall. So vines are definitely, something that could be significant. I agree.
But is there any real effort in?
I mentioned that we developed this adaptation plan. So what we did is we had 70 people across the department identify vulnerabilities, and in very general terms, talk about what we can do about it. So that's what I showed you, like kind of big picture ideas. The next step that we're just beginning now is to work with individual parks to look at their climate change vulnerabilities and what they can do to address those. So that's probably where that kind of thing is going to kind of rise to the top in terms of individual state parks.
Well, I think it's good for the state parks, but also for them to encourage the individual landowners. Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
Has DCNR developed a tree species list for future, for climate change?
Well, what we have is, remember the graphics I showed you for each of the physiographic regions? We have those in the plan. And so that's the closest we have. Now, the way to interpret that is it evaluates for each of those tree species whether climatic conditions will be favorable under those different scenarios. that doesn't take into account necessarily like soils in different part of the state and things like that. It's not a guarantee that a tree is going to grow or not grow, but that's the closest thing we have. So we work with, I mentioned a group called the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and they engage and are funded by the U.S. Forest Service. So the U.S. Forest Service has done this kind of on a broad scale for the whole country. I think we're the first state that they did it for individually, and they have also worked, for example, with the city of Philadelphia, and they have a Philadelphia tree species list as well.
I'm a tree planter for my town. And
Ah, okay.
The town actually has, I don't know where they woke up, but we have a 10-year plan to replant the town and take out the oaks are dying off and so bring them down. So the decisions I need to make now are going to have an effect 70 years from now.
Yep.
So we're the front vanguard of this whole thing. So we're hearing it, we want to do it, but then you turn around and say, okay, I gotta act now. Where do I get my material? So I was told by, I guess, a Delaware Regional Planning Group, I attended one of these climate change. They're saying basically, what's growing in Savannah, will work here in the future. So then you say, okay, we'll look at their trees, but then where do you go get them?
Yeah.
If you want to put them, and stuff. So there's a lot of problems that folks in this room are faced with.
Yeah.
Besides awareness,
Right. And it is a conundrum when you talk about trees, because so if you want to plant a tree that's going to do well 75 years from now, it might not do well right now. So do you plant it now? Does it suffer? Does it survive? It really is a challenge. So once again, that takes you back to the whole idea of diversity. So you get a good mix of different species because some may do well and some may not do well.
I have a question about the invasive stuff and with species change, right? I mean, so somebody might say, well, you should plant this grass, but somebody's going to say, well, no, that's invasive. Well, yeah, because the natural stuff 10 years from now is not going to be here anymore.
Right.
So how do you, so what I'm saying is what becomes invasive?
Yeah, well, it is possible that something that's not invasive now will become bee. And there's actually one example, I don't remember the name of there's an aquatic plant, historically, it occurs in Pennsylvania that is becoming invasive. Is it the milfoil? There's some aquatic plant that we're having an issue with now that was not invasive until recently, it just has become that way. So I know I don't have a good answer for you, but you I would say look farther south, look at the characteristics of that plant. If you look down south and that plant is like kudzu, admittedly people didn't know what an invasive was back when they planted kudzu, but that was a very misinformed decision to begin planting
So
it.
maybe Newfar?
That doesn't sound familiar. But you're right, it's a tough question. So.
And so sometimes it's really tough knowing the genetics too, because when you do really careful genetic studies, sometimes you find that they became invasive because of the introduction of exotic genes. So like with, what is it,
Stiltgrass?
the stiltgrass.
Japanese
yes.
stiltgrass, yeah.
Yeah, Japanese stiltgrass, yeah.
All right, looks like I'm getting a hook. So, thank you everybody for coming. Great questions, I appreciate it.